You were justified. If you're justified in the first shot, you're justified in the last shot. There is no independent thought that's going into it. He's not thinking to pull the trigger the last time. It's just coming.
Okay. So let me ask you. Let me give you another.
nature.
Let me give you another analogy. Right. I have a rape gene. Right. When I get super excited and scared, I have an uncontrollable urge to just like rape motherfuckers. Like that's how I fight. Right. For whatever reason, I was like, I had a wrestling coach that was like, real handsy feely and taught me fighting the wrong way and like raped me. And so like when I'm fighting, right, I like my natural inclination is to bend the person over and get them onto their back and then pull their pants down and fuck them. Right. Now, let's say I get into a fight and the person that I'm fighting swung first, right? They swung first, they go to punch me, and I'm defending myself, and I get into the heat of the moment, and then the rape gene kicks in. And I pull down his pants, and I start sodomizing him, right? Is the sodomy of the person that swung at me justified?
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Crucible. I'm your host, Andrew Wilson. Coming back from a long weekend. I was out visiting Zen Shapiro. Was there for his baptism, and now I am a godparent. Right? It's all formal. You know what I mean? It's all recorded in the church. So I'm a godfather. You got to do what I say now. Anyway, Pedro's good as far as I know. Anyway, we got a good show for you tonight. No moderator, none of that shit. Just good old fashioned mano a mano. Me against Fabian Liberty on two different worldviews. No awesome epic intro. None of that. We're just gonna get right into it. Fabian, how you doing tonight, man?
I'm doing all right.
You're muted,
Getting over.
by the way.
Oh, hold on. Hey, I'm back. Sorry. Yeah, I getting over that that lovely new version of Coof that's going around.
Oh, really?
Dude, it took me out of commission for like 2 weeks.
No shit. Huh.
Yeah, like I had like one wave and then another wave, but I'm feeling good. Yeah, you don't need a moderator when you have two people that actually argue in good faith. And that's an incredibly rare thing in the YouTube Twitch politics space.
Well, I mean, we'll find out if one was needed or not by the time we're done with this, I guess.
I don't plan on being too mean.
Yeah, so let's kind of dive into it, man. I'm going to let you open because you kind of had you had brought this up. You had mentioned a response to my Twitter, and I kind of want to know what your problem is with what I said and where you stand on this whole shooting, so we can get into it.
Yeah, so I mean, I had been arguing with a bunch of people on this because it's a bit of a hot take that I have on the Taqueria shooting, right? At least in conservative, libertarian spaces, where when talking about self-defense is something that most people kind of like believe that, like, if someone pulls a gun on you, and they're brandishing a firearm, they're threatening your life with a weapon, right? So often we even use that as an analogy, like the pointing the gun at you, right? That it's an imminent threat to your life, that any form of self-defense is justified. And I don't think that any and all forms of self-defense, well, let me rephrase. I think self-defense is always justified, but I don't think any reaction is necessarily justified at a certain point. And in this shooting, I agree with everything that occurred. The only thing I disagree with that I think is unjustified is the final shot. Now, for anybody that hasn't seen the video, I don't think Andrew or I can actually show you the video on stream because it violates TOS. Shows a dead body, right? However, a man comes into a taqueria, brandishing a firearm, attempting to rob the establishment, potentially attempting to murder all of the people in there. Who fucking knows? He walks past an individual who's ready and armed, right? Concealed carrying, like a responsible gun owner, and then moves past him again. And when he does so, the guy unloads on him, walks over to him, finds the firearm on the ground, kicks the firearm away, and then goes in for an execution shot to shoot him while he's on the ground, not moving, in the back of the head. That final shot, to me, is an unjustified killing. And the lefties, of course, they all fucking agree with me because they all hate guns and they hate the idea of self-defense. So any fucking crack they can find to like find people to argue or bicker about this they'll use. But that's basically my stance. Like, we can get into it, but I don't find that people are actually justifying self-defense here. I don't find that when you break it down to like the ethics and really say like, well, what makes a killing justified or not justified, that this doesn't actually fit parameters, that most people are just feeling a sense of justice. They're feeling a sense of like, that fucker got it because he's a piece of shit, obviously, and they're happy about it. But when you ask them, well, like, what makes this justified? I'm not seeing good arguments. and so I challenge you then, I guess, to give me a good argument as to why the execution shot specifically was justified.
I think there was a little bit of loaded language at the last bit there, the execution shot. You consider that to be an execution. I don't. Give me a second and I'll lay my case out.
Fair enough.
Before I do lay my case out, though, I just want to make sure that we can get get what happened down, and make sure I'm not characterizing this any differently than you would.
Yeah, I'm not trying to.
Walks in, he's robbing the place. A bunch of people are on the floor. He's brandishing his guns his gun at multiple people. You agree that that's true?
Yes.
Okay. He's obviously threatening them for their money. You agree that that's true, right?
Yes.
Okay, so he turns around as he's leaving. Guy gets up, shoots. I counted 4 times, and then as he approaches, he fires 4 more times. After he grabs his gun, he fires 1 more time, almost point blank to the head. You consider that to be what we're discussing then? So I'm not.
Yeah. And I'm stating all the first 8 shots are justified, and I don't think the 9th shot is justified.
Yeah, got it. So let me.
And also, for the record, for everybody, nobody here, as far as I'm concerned, I tried to find info, but I didn't do a ton of research. Nobody knows how many of those 8 shots connected.
No, I understand. I understand all that, but
right.
let me make a case. So I don't actually talk about my personal life very much on stream, because I don't want to. As you know, I have lots of enemies who have literally tried to kill me in the past, and I don't want them to keep on doing that. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a preface for my expertise in this field. So I've been a professional gunsmith since I was 22 years old. It was the first field I ever went into. I've been a federally firearms licensed dealer in 4 states. I've also trained everything from prison guards to military on post. And I did that and still do that to this day. So I guess we'd be going on 16 years now. I'm in every sense of the word a weapons expert. Also, I'm in every sense of the word an expert in the field of law when it comes to self-defense shooting. And I'll send you the proofs if you'd like, because I know that you won't release them, but I've been called into many court cases as an expert witness. Many of the cases have actually hinged on my testimony. So that's a little about my expertise. Let me try to get you guys to understand the justification.
So you're just trying to prove that you are indeed the Godfather?
Right. No. I don't. I before we get into the how do you know that? I just
for sure. I'm only interested in the ethical question, not necessarily the legal description.
We're gonna dive in. I want to dive.
We can get into that
because I think both of them are important, because we have the law because it's informed by the ethics. That's kind of the point. So as we dive into this, try to understand a couple of things. First and foremost, there's something called panic shooting. Nobody ever takes this into account, panic fire. In Vietnam, there was a firearm made, the XM15A1, later allocated the M16A1. It was made by Eugene Stoner. It was a fully automatic light infantry rifle. The problem that they found in the trial runs, especially when McNamara commissioned them from Eugene Stoner, was that when the soldiers were firing, when they were under fire, even simulated fire, they would dump the entire magazine because they panicked. They panicked. It's written into most of our self-defense codes that panic fire is something a layman's going to do, especially when you're talking about controlling a situation. Police officers are trained for it, but even military with exceptional training are prone to panic fire, which is why I bring up the XM15A1, later M16A1 to A2, etc., to the modern AR-15. When a person gets up and he begins to fire his weapon, he is considered to be in a state of panic, regardless of training. Why wouldn't he be panicked? Why wouldn't he be panicked? Of course he'd be panicked. Everything is elevated. Most self-defense happens within seconds, just like this particular shooting happened within seconds. In some ways, some people have described this as being surreal, where they feel a sense of disconnect. However, they're in absolute panic and fear. When we look at this as an outsider and we're looking in and we see that last shot, the last shot, it appears to us like there was a moment almost of reflection or introspection or something like this before he fired, but chances are there actually wasn't. He almost looked like he picked up the gun as an afterthought and he fired that last round. There's absolutely no reason to believe that he himself, under a severe state of panic, understood the threat was over until all movement was done. Sometimes in these self-defense situations, people will fire to the point their magazine is exhausted. They will reload and continue to fire. And they're essentially excused because under witness testimony from experts, they find out that, wait, as it turns out, that panic firing is a real thing. So he fired until he subjectively thought that the threat was done. And he is who the law is going to focus on because subjectively, he's the one who's been threatened. Why is it moral for him to do that? Because you can't tell me why it would be moral for him to fire the first 10 shots, but not the 11th shot. There's no justification from your end. If one shot is okay for self-defense and killing, why not 10 shots? Why would there be a distinction? There's no distinction with merit, and I want to hear what that distinction with merit is.
Yeah, so panic fire is true, right? And it helps us understand the state of the mind of the individual, right? And whether or not the individual thought they were doing something wrong, right? And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to bring up in our current judicial system, right? In terms of, like, you know, whether or not this person should be prosecuted for what they did, right? And that's a perfectly legitimate argument against that said prosecution. But it's irrelevant to the facts of whether or not what they did was ethical or unethical, right? Like, the action itself is against another person, right? So it doesn't matter what that person's state of mind is as to whether or not what they did is justifiable or unjustifiable. It just doesn't play into the argument. It plays into the way that we feel about it. And if it plays into the way that we've, how's that ridiculous?
Because what is the justification for murder other than intent?
What is the justification for murder other than intent? You can accidentally
how do you know something's murder unless you're associating intent with it? So why is something not
murder
manslaughter but is murder?
Right. An unjustified killing is an unjustified killing, regardless of whether or not it's manslaughter or murder.
Yeah, but it's intent. Intent is a distinction.
No. The intent is the distinction between our current legal system's definition of manslaughter or murder. It's not a distinction between whether or not the killing is justified or unjustified, whether or not the killing is ethical or unethical.
It is. And I'll explain to you why it is. Because if you accidentally kill somebody, you are unjustified in killing them, but it's not murder. The intent.
Yes.
The intent's the distinction.
We're saying the same thing.
Well, then specifically, I'm asking you why you're taking the intent out. Because the intent of this gentleman was not to murder. The intent of this gentleman was to stop.
Because my argument isn't about intent, right? My argument isn't this is a bad guy that needs to be off of the streets. My argument is this is an unjustified killing.
What's unjustified about it?
What's unjustified is the final shot, right? So
that's not unjustified. I'll give you an example of how I know. Let me ask you this question. Assume that you had a samurai warrior and we're in the feudal era.
Mhm.
The samurai warrior has been trained to cut. When he draws his sword, he cuts diagonally and then he thrusts. Always, this is how he's been trained, to the point it's muscle memory.
Mhm.
A man comes in, let's say, with a musket, okay, and he's holding the joint up. The samurai stands up and he does his two-cut exchange. The first cut cuts the person's head clean off, but he continues and he thrusts because of muscle memory. So he does both of these actions as muscle memory has compelled him to do. So the first cut takes off the head. That was maybe not the intent of the slice, but that's what happened. The head's off. He continues with the cut. The sword gets stuck in the body before the body ever falls down. But the first cut most certainly killed him. Is the second thrust, in your opinion, unjustified?
Well, it depends upon a whole bunch of other contexts. First of all,
What?
obviously, this isn't the samurai era. Second of all, the samurai might be the equivalent of a police officer, which might change the training and things of that nature and what we expect of them. But I don't think, I don't think that it's an apt comparison to talk about the instantaneous samurai cutting situation in what is or isn't justified. But even still,
Well, I
it
think
doesn't
it is,
change the
because
fact that we're talking
you're
about
saying
what
it's
is.
unjustified because of a final shot. I'm saying
Mhm.
that the final shot is based on intuition, muscle memory, the same as it would be with the samurai. There's no difference, heightened senses, this kind of thing. It just so happens the samurai with the first cut with a katana, which is totally possible, the head comes completely off. He follows through as his muscle training has determined he do. What did he do that was unjustified? He
What
clearly
he did,
stabbed him a second time after taking the head off, baby.
yeah. So, but again, right? Like, you're appealing to the idea of panic fire, right? Now you're using a samurai analogy that I just reject because it's distracting from
Well, you
what
can't
we're talking
reject
about.
it. It's
We're
it's the
talking about
same
panic
thing.
fire, right? We're talking
No,
about
no,
a
we're talking
state of
about
mind.
you're saying it's overkill because of that final shot. I'm saying, why wouldn't it be overkill for the samurai for that final stab? What's the distinction here?
Okay, so if the samurai, right, is engaged in some combat with a musket fire situation, right? And for whatever, and the musket fire person is an aggressor, right? Let's try and keep the analogy as close as we can to the current
Well, what do you
situation.
mean by you mean like the aggressor in this
Yeah,
scenario? Yeah, yeah.
assuming the first cut was justified, right? Like,
Mhm.
assuming the guy came up to him with the musket and said, "I'm gonna fucking blow your brains out because I hate Japos," right? And like came after him,
Well,
right?
what if it's just a potentiality that he may, and he is pointing the musket, so he's under duress, he
Okay,
feels
yeah,
threatened?
yeah. So I mean, both would likely be justified if someone just randomly came up to you and. But I'm trying to make, like, not have any gray area in the justification of the first cut.
Okay,
We'll
gotcha.
assume for sure that the first cut is justified, right? And so he acts off of muscle memory to further damage the corpse of the person that he just killed, because the first
Mhm.
cut off his head. Yeah, the second cut is not justified.
So you're
Now,
saying,
do we
hang
choose to
on,
prosecute him?
no, no, no.
Like,
I need to know why it's not justified. Why is it not justified? What did he do wrong? That's unjustifiable. Following through with the muscle memory he has, first swing, that he didn't know that the head intentionally came off. He doesn't know this psychologically. Inside of his brain, he's doing exactly what he's trained to do: swing, stab. He swung, he stabbed. The circumstances just so happened the head came off at the first
so
swing,
what do you
and he
think
followed through.
justification? What do you think? What is the justification then? As you see it, it seems to be that your argument, right, of the shooting is that because the initial shots were justified, right, because it was legitimate use of defensive violence, right, and we both agree on this, right, that the initial shots were justified.
Then we both agree that it
That
was justified that he be shot. We're disagreeing on the final shot being
right,
justified.
right. So
So
your
this is
argument,
where,
hold on,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
let me see if I can
Yeah.
get it, and then see if I can recapture it and see if I'm missing something and I don't understand. So it seems that your argument is that anything that follows in that regard that you believe changes the state of the mind of the shooter, right, is justified because it is it is an uncontrollable, out of the circumstances of the shooter's situation, right? Like,
Well,
he's entered into
it's
panic fire.
So there is no consciousness that's moving into this. The state of mind has been irreparably altered, at least for this amount of time. Biologically, you don't have control over this. Some people,
Okay.
even hunters who are in both of
Mm-hmm.
our audiences, will explain to you sensory deprivation, which happens when you have heightened adrenaline. Some people see it as tunnel vision. For instance, Fabian, have you ever been really close to a car accident and it seemed like time slowed down or sped up? Both of those are part of sensory deprivation. It can sometimes heighten your hearing or heighten your vision. Sometimes it'll feel like time is slowing down, sometimes speeding up. But none of these are things that you have any control over. You were
Mm.
justified. If you're justified in the first shot, you're justified in the last shot. There is no independent thought that's going into it. He's not thinking to pull the trigger the last time. It's just coming.
Okay.
That's
So let me ask you. Let me give you.
it's
Let me give you
second
another.
nature.
Let me give you another analogy. Right. I have a rape gene. Right. When I get super excited and scared, I have an uncontrollable urge to just like rape motherfuckers. Like that's how I fight. Right. For whatever reason, I was like, I had a wrestling coach that was like, real handsy feely and taught me fighting the wrong way and like raped
Yeah.
me. And so like when I'm fighting, right, I like my natural inclination is to bend the person over and get them onto their back and then pull their pants down and fuck them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say I get into a fight and the person that I'm fighting swung first. Right. They swung first. They go to punch me and I'm defending myself and I get into the heat of the moment. And then the rape gene kicks in and I pull down his pants and I start sodomizing him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is the sodomy of the person that swung at me justified because I'm in a state of mind where I can no longer like really kind of control what I'm doing? And I was just defending myself, but because of the rape gene that I have that was triggered by the trauma of my wrestling coach, I'm just going to sodomize this guy.
I get the argument. So I'll just cut in real quick. Do
Yeah,
we
go ahead.
agree at any time the sodomy was justified?
Do we agree at any time that the sodomy was
Yeah.
justified? No.
So I would okay. So if the answer is no, then if we were to agree, let's just say hypothetically the sodomy was justified, you'd have to make a justification for why him coming was unjustified. Right? You see what I'm saying?
So
That's that's it, motherfucker. That's it.
No. The sodomy's not
hypothetical's
justified.
done.
This and
Right,
why
we
the
both
reason that the
agree
sodomy
in this
no
instance the sodomy wouldn't be justified.
the reason, right, that the sodomy is not justified, right, is because this person's not trying to sodomize you, right? This person hasn't raped you. There's no restitution to be paid. Once the target is neutralized and you're no longer in a state of war, you don't get to then pull down their pants and sodomize them, right?
That's absurd. The sodomy's unjustified regardless of you doing any
As
type of self-defense.
as is the execution shot.
No, there is no execution shot. My argument is that this was not an execution nor an execution shot. This was a person responding under muscle memory, completely justified in self-defense.
Did
You
he
would have to
train to do
produce
execution shots?
No. You don't need to be trained in order to fire your
Because that would be a
gun at all.
problem. That would be a problem, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but hang on. There's no training in. But even if let's just say he was trained, it wouldn't
Right.
matter.
It's not
Right?
muscle memory.
What I'm saying is that when your senses become deprived, you're moving off of muscle memory, which at this point I assume is something akin to this, Fabian. Just squeezing a trigger. And that's
Mhm.
exactly what it looked like to me. He approached him
Yeah.
while continuing to squeeze the trigger. Now I can tell you he wasn't trained. The reasons I know he wasn't trained is he never would have approached him. He never
Yeah,
would have
he just
gone
stayed
over.
back, yeah.
He never would have gone over, tried to remove a gun. He never would have gotten close to him. This is a
Mhm.
person under complete panic. Your sodomy analogy doesn't work here because you're talking about two different events. The first, you and I would agree, is justified. Somebody swung at you, so you have a right to take him down or defend yourself. We also probably agree that defense has to be at least somewhat reasonable. You have to have some type of reasonable defensive acumen when it comes, like as if a 7-year-old came over and punched you in the shoulder, for instance, you
Why?
can't beat him to death with a baseball bat. Well, I'll get into why.
Why?
But before I do, I need to get back to the sodomy point and just say neither of us would agree on the premise of the sodomy ever being correct. Therefore, there's no justification. We don't need to justify the last 20 seconds because it's all unjustified. If we were dealing with a case here, where the entire, hang on, I'm almost done, where the entirety of the shooting we agreed on the premise was entirely unjustified, you might have an argument.
Okay, so we can throw away the samurai analogy now because because training matters, right?
No, we can't.
Well, one's panic fire,
they're both panic.
One's is training, right?
Nope. They're both under in a state
all
of
right,
panic.
well, you would like to keep an analogy that there are principal differences between them, and I would like to throw it away. You want to keep it, you go ahead and keep it in your brain, but I'm not going to talk about it anymore. So again, you're saying the sodomy isn't
because it blows your argument out. That's why you don't want to talk about it anymore. It does.
It doesn't. I mean, it simply doesn't, and we've already visited that. But your argument now is that the reason sodomy it doesn't matter, right? The principal difference that panic fire justifies it, but the sodomy rape gene doesn't, is because the sodomy rape gene situation is that the sodomy never would have been justified at one point, but the act of pulling a trigger was justified at one point. And so the consequences of the psychological effect of additional shots.
No, I'm saying it never ceased being justified.
Okay, so here's my question. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say a big dude swings at me, right? And he punches me for whatever reason, right? He's aggressive. He's like, I saw you looking at my girl, right? And we get into a bar fight, right? Now I'm beating him up, right? And then I've got him right. He doesn't even have me on half guard. I've got him full straddled, and I'm beating his face into the concrete, right? And then I pick up a rock and I smash his brains in after the guy is unconscious and he's no longer fighting back. And I just keep hitting him until his brains are splattered everywhere. You would say that is a justified killing because he swung on me?
I think it can be, yes, because it depends on what your state of mind was. And I think that the law and morally, from your own standpoint, libertarian, my own standpoint, Christian ethics, would give a huge accounting for the fact that inside of a situation you did not bring on yourself, where you were attacked, just like a police officer friend of mine once said, as a guy was laying next to him, black and blue, just because you lost the fight doesn't mean you didn't start the fight, right? So in this particular case, I do think it's justified to continuously attack until you, the subjective interlocutor, feels that the attacker is incapacitated. Do I think that onlookers may have a different outlook to that? Maybe. But I also think that you, in this particular case, what does self-defense entail? It's not equal force back to what you're met with. It's reasonable force back with what you're met with. And reasonable is a very subjective standard. Reasonable is subjective mostly to you. And most of the time people go to prison is because when they're being cross-examined, cops or whoever get them to admit that they think they used an reasonable amount of force, not because them as the subjective person actually did, but just because that's what they actually said. So do I think it's justified to then, if you have him on the ground, he's gone limp and you continuously are hitting him? Well, yeah, you don't know if he's going to get back up. He's huge and he could easily continue to attack you. He started the fight. You fight until you think the threat is eliminated.
So what is the principal difference in your analogy between a reasonable person and an unreasonable person? Because if I'm unreasonable, right? Does my subjectivity of fear matter?
Versus reasonable person. I think almost everybody is.
Your argument hinges. No, your argument hinges upon the person is reasonable.
Reasonable versus unreasonable use of force, not reasonable versus an unreasonable person.
So what if I'm an unreasonable person?
What does that have to do with reasonable amount of force? You can be an unreasonable person and still use a reasonable amount of force.
Right. So right.
So what are you talking?
You just defeated your own argument.
How?
Because you just defeated your own argument. The debate is over.
How?
You just lost. Unequivocally, you just lost.
Unequivocally, right? Because explain how.
Yeah, I'll explain it to you, right? Because the premise of your argument is that you have a reasonable individual, right? And the subjectivity of their fear in the moment about when they believe the threat is unneutralized. And you just admitted, right, that that a person could use an
No, you're just
unreasonable amount of
You're
force.
smuggling in this bizarre
I'm not smuggling in
premise.
shit. No, you
Yeah,
just
now
no,
tell
don't
me.
run
I'm
away
going to
from
tell you
this.
what you're smuggling in. You're smuggling in that I ever said anything about the person being reasonable or unreasonable. I never did.
Okay, so what happens if you have an unreasonable person? You said that they could use an unreasonable amount of force.
Yeah.
Right.
What could be perceived
That's the
as
problem.
it could be
I am
perceived as
stating,
that.
right, I am stating that the
Yeah, but if it
execution
happens to
shot
a
is
reasonable person, too.
unreasonable. Yes,
Yeah,
a
that has-
reasonable person
what
could be
does that have
panicked
to
and in
do with the
fear,
price of
but
tea
it
in
makes it
China,
unjustified.
Fabian, that has nothing to do with what I'm saying. Whether they're
It
reasonable
has
or
everything
unreasonable.
to do with it. I just
How?
I just proved
How?
it.
Well,
You're
you didn't
pretending
prove
to not
anything.
understand what I'm saying. You're playing
Well,
the
I
dumb
can't.
card.
Listen,
And
well,
you've done this before. Don't
well,
play
let me
this
try
shit
to help
with me.
you. Let me try to help you here. You got to.
I don't need
explain
help.
this to
You're
me.
the one that needs help.
At what point did I
Mhm.
say anything about the person being reasonable or unreasonable? I brought up force being reasonable or unreasonable.
Right. You brought up an outside interpretation, the observer opinion about what is and isn't reasonable. At the same time, you maintained the contradiction of that the subjectivity of the fear, the subjectivity of the fear matters in intent and whether or not something is justified.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that every human being, whether they're reasonable, unreasonable, some status in between, whatever you define unreasonable as being, maybe you don't like pickles on your hamburger and that's unreasonable. I don't fucking know what you consider unreasonable. But whatever that opinion is as to what's reasonable or unreasonable doesn't matter when it comes to the subjective use of force when you're talking about what is reasonable. It's important to understand that most human beings are going to, and we would agree on this, respond in a way to self-defense where their senses are heightened, they're under extreme duress, their adrenaline is pumping, they have sense deprivation, all types of different things are occurring in their mind, whether they're a reasonable or unreasonable person doesn't matter.
So is there ever an instance, right, where an individual can believe that their violent response back in self-defense, right, is protecting them, right? And the outside observer can say that you went too far. Ever.
Oh, sure. I mean, of course, that can happen, but that's not justification
so
that it's true.
Okay. So if it's not justification,
listen,
so what
I
you're
can
saying,
grant that.
No. We got no.
You know.
So what you're saying is that so long as I am panicked and in fear, all amount of violence towards any aggression is justified if I believe that my life is in threat.
No, that's not what I'm saying. But what
Why?
I am saying is that the accountability for the use of force is going to hinge upon your perspective.
Okay. Why? Why is it?
Because
who else? There are certain situations where my response to a perceived threat, where I believe that I am under threat of life, right, can sometimes go too far. Because that's my opinion with this case, right?
Because you could be you could be in some way destroying or defeating some kind of virtue or some kind of ethical standard. In this case, you would probably be violating a deontological universal standard. Like, for instance, a baby claws your eye, and so you shake the baby to death, right? This would be a deontological standard. We would use biblical ethics for justification that is bad. The same way we would use biblical ethics for the justification that beating a person who attacks you to death is okay.
Right. So you're just saying because the Bible says certain things are bad?
No, I'm saying because my ethics hinge upon a mixture of deontology and virtue, which is what the entirety of Western law is based around. This is what I'm going to hinge my justifications on. And you're going to hinge most of your justifications on it too, because most of the things you think are bad come from my worldview, not from yours.
Right. Well, again, I think that it's unjustified because it becomes an act of aggression once the threat is neutralized.
You don't know that the threat is neutralized. So let's get into that too. How do you know that threat is neutralized? Have you ever heard of what's called the Voorhees effect?
Go ahead, tell it to me.
Jason Voorhees. I'm sure you know who that is, right? Friday the 13th, Jason Voorhees. He has a big hockey mask. He always comes back after he's been shot, right? The Voorhees effect works like this, and you can find many such cases of this.
Yeah.
Person gets shot 15 times. They fall on the ground. They get up, grab a gun, grab another weapon, charge again, or fire again.
Okay.
So how do you know for sure that the threat was neutralized, Fabian, except in your own subjective personal consciousness of your own subjective perception? You think so. You don't know that guy had a gun next to him, right? You can't guarantee me that if this man had stopped firing, that guy would not have grabbed that gun and fired. You can't guarantee that. So, and if he moved, which he did move, and you see this in the video too, after the guy grabbed the gun, the dude on the ground did move, and so he fired the last shot. That is when the threat was neutralized. And I think that any reasonable onlooker could say that's when the threat is neutralized.
All right,
why wouldn't they?
So what you're saying is, right, is if someone is an attacker, right, all violence against them is justified, up to murder or up to killing. Sorry.
Well, it's not murder, right?
Right.
But yes,
so if you get in a bar fight, right, there's no amount of violence that is unjustified.
Well, it's neutral until proven otherwise.
Okay, so
in other words, it can be completely justifiable depending on circumstances, and it cannot be. This is why the law is written with the entailments to the actual ethics the way it is written, understanding that every instance is a gray area, which is going to hinge upon the circumstances of each individual instance. Which is why it says
I mean, he could have sprouted wings and flown and turned into an angel.
Well, hang on. This is why it says things like reasonable force. What is reasonable force? To you, it might seem unreasonable that you beat a guy to death who attacked you. To another onlooker, it may seem completely and totally reasonable. When we're talking about whether or not it's justified, though, neither of them could say that fighting back was unjustified. The argument is over to which the extent of it was to a point. What's the point where it became unjustified?
So your argument is that human beings, right, no matter how much damage you do to them, could potentially, even if it's a small percentage, could potentially continue to fight. And therefore, it is perfectly appropriate to make sure that in any physical violent interaction where the person threatens your life in some degree, either explicitly or, raises a gun to you or something.
I just explained
that you can
this is all situational. Always situational.
What did I get wrong? What did I get wrong?
Well, you're getting wrong the dynamics of the use of force. So, like, for instance, again, I would bring up something like shaking a baby to death because they clawed your face. Is that a reasonable use of force? No, that's not a reasonable use of force. That would violate our virtues, and that would violate our deontological ethical foundation.
Okay,
for
so
Christianity, which we derive our ethics.
for your moral framework. Let me add that it's an adult aggressor. So any situation with an adult aggressor.
No, not any, but many.
Okay, so give me a situation then, and tell me the substantive difference, right, between them.
Okay, a guy runs over to give you a right hook across the face. He trips and he hits his head on a pool table. He's knocked unconscious. He's rendered completely unconscious. You turn around and you leave the bar and you're about to get in your car. And then you think, wait, gee, maybe that guy one day will wake up, right? He's gonna wake up. Maybe someone's gonna tell him where I live. I better go back in that bar and beat his ass to death right now. That would be completely and totally unjustifiable, and it would be murder. Clearly, the threat
was never self-defense.
Well, I mean, it would have. Well, yeah, I think it was self-defense for a second. You would have been when his head hit the table. If you had hit him once,
give me an example that doesn't require self-defense.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It would be based on the circumstance. You'd have to give me an example, and then maybe I could explain one to you.
Okay,
just because I can't think of one off the top of my head is meaningless.
Right, but what we're talking about, right, is that you believe that once combat is initiated between two people, once a state of war has been declared, let's use the Locke's position, right? Like Locke says that even if a thief that breaks into your house at night is unarmed, that you're justified in killing that person or in fighting against that person.
You
Right,
can't
because you
assume
don't.
they're unarmed.
Right, yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
Locke's position, right? He's
Yeah.
declared a state of war, right? And
Mhm.
so you have a right to neutralize this person. What I'm arguing is that the person is neutralized, right? And you're saying, well, you don't know that they're neutralized because of the Voorhees effect. You're saying no one ever knows that a person is neutralized. So once combat
No,
is
it's not that
initiated,
nobody ever knows. It's that in this particular case, you don't know. You didn't know in this case because you have a gun. You have
can you give me
a gun laying
can you
down
give me an
next to a
example where
person
someone
who's laying
would
down.
know unequivocally, where combat would start, and then they would know unequivocally that the person is neutralized without? So you're saying, like, if you tied them up, and then after being tied up, they're neutralized.
It could be,
but they
any
could break the
number-
ties.
It could be any number of different reasonings for a person being neutralized to a point that you understand and can reasonably assume that they're neutralized. Like, for instance, 6 people maybe are holding them down. I would say that person is neutralized, and you wouldn't be justified in continuing to shoot him then.
Right.
I would say, for instance, a person who is completely and totally passed out, you can see that they're passed out, and you continuously just beat them to
if
the
they're
point,
if they're
of
passed out,
absurdity.
what about if they have multiple gunshot wounds and they're disarmed and they're lying face down on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the circumstances, that could be bad.
Yeah, this is the situation we're talking about. Is someone with multiple gunshot wounds laying down on the
What
ground
did I
and
just
disarmed.
say? Depending on the circumstances, that could be bad. Depending on the circumstances, too, that could be totally justified. It's
Right.
always going to depend on the
You're
situation.
you're adding histrionics into it. You're adding how you feel. That's the problem with
Yeah,
your
but
argument right here.
No,
You're not
because-
actually talking about anything objective.
Because this is
you're
based on
adding
histrionics.
subjectivity.
You are also adding on how you feel. You are also using the same
No, I'm not.
exact argument. Yeah, you feel he was incapacitated. Prove it.
This is you have someone
You
that is.
feel he was incapacitated. If not, prove it.
So I have to prove that angels don't exist? Do I have to prove angels don't exist?
Are you going to answer my question? Can you prove?
Do I
that
have
the
to
guy
prove
was
that angels don't
incapacitated?
exist?
Answer my
Because
question like I've been good enough to
could he-
answer yours. Can you prove he was incapacitated?
Well, your argument hinges upon the existence
Are you
of God.
gonna
So
answer
God
my
could have healed
question?
him.
You just said you're using histrionics. I'm not. And then I prove that you are. You still want to answer the question. You are also. You're using your own subjective analysis here to say that you believe, based on your feelings, he was
Mhm.
incapacitated. Can you demonstrate that? Can you show it to me? Can you prove it to me?
Multiple gunshot wounds and disarmed.
That
If
is
that's not a high enough
proof.
standard for you,
It's
right?
not a high enough standard
that's
for
not-
anybody, including the law.
Which is the
including
point.
the law.
Which is you prove, right? You prove with your own argumentation, right? That once
you're
someone
wrong?
engages, that once someone engages in combat, all violence against them is justified from your position.
I have not.
You believe that
proven
you can
that.
kill anyone.
I have drawn clear distinctions that it's
No, you haven't. You're
situational.
lying.
I'm drawing one right this second. You said
Right,
it was hang on. You said it was histrionics, and it turns out you're the one, indeed, sir, who's using histrionics.
No,
You're the
no,
one
no,
who's
no.
saying that even
You're
though
saying-
you cannot demonstrate this, your feelings tell you.
No,
that the
I demonstrate that he's no longer
Hang
a
on.
threat.
You haven't demonstrated that. You say
Yes,
that
I
your
have.
feelings. Okay, then is the Voorhees effect real?
Right.
Do people get up?
Right. Okay, so what you're saying is, again, your argument hinges upon the fact that there is an incredibly small possibility that someone that is incapacitated could go into a state of no longer being incapacitated.
It's
right?
common.
Which justifies
It's common.
yes.
Right?
When you say that what matters is the intent and the subjectivity of the attacker, then
Yes.
you need to bite the bullet that all violence and
don't.
all killing is
No, I don't.
justified. Yes,
No.
you do. Why
No,
are
I
you
don't.
pretending?
Because
Okay,
there's
well,
nuance across the board. I've explained.
no,
it
you don't
in
just
depth.
get to say nuance,
you,
bro.
You yourself understand that there's nuance across the board because the only justification you have for why this started out being justified, but it ended not being justified is based on your own subjective analysis that your fifis tell you that that final shot was unwarranted, but you can't actually demonstrate it. You don't know what his status was. You don't know what the guy saw on the ground. You don't know what that movement might have entailed. You don't know that it might have looked from his perspective like he wasn't grabbing for the gun the guy just picked up. You don't know any of these facts. All you're saying is that based on your own fifis.
To be fair, right? We have the benefit of hindsight, right? So we know that those things weren't true, right? But the question is whether or not the attacker knew those things in that moment, right? Just to be to clarify for the audience, right?
That's correct.
Does the attacker know that he doesn't have a second gun, right? Does the attacker know that his shots have mortally wounded him or not, right?
He doesn't know any of these things.
He fired 8 shots, right? And 50 Cent survived 9, right? So maybe the 8 shots weren't enough, right? Even if all of them connected. The problem is not about the intent. It's not about the subjectivity of the person and whether or not they have fear. Because if subjectivity of fear is all that matters, I can have an irrational fear, right? And once my irrational fear enters the situation, it becomes that doesn't justify the situation. If I have PTSD and I just start blasting on grandma because she happened to trip into my yard, that's not justified self-defense just because I have a fear.
What is castle doctrine? What do you think castle doctrine is?
So if grandma is walking on the sidewalk, right?
Yeah.
And she trips for a second onto your grass, right? And she has every intent of picking herself up and getting back on the sidewalk. You're saying it's justified to grab your Tommy gun and just unload into grandma and tell?
No, of course not. I asked you a specific question. I already told you why. I already told you why. It would be against a basis of ethical systems in my religious practice. It would be against a series of ethics, deontological and virtue both. I can point you to the exact virtues even.
But all of that is post hoc. All of that is post hoc.
Everything we're talking about is post hoc. That's the only way we can make justifications inside these specific. Yes.
No, you're doing a rationalization.
Right now is talking post hoc.
What you're saying?
Talking about
what you're saying?
Let me get back to this and let me finish my point.
You're so full of it.
Finish my point.
You're so full
of it. I need
to
know this. Are you aware of what threat levels are? Threat level yellow, threat level orange, threat level red. This is a training that a person going through CPL training would have in a state like Texas or a state like Michigan that have. Michigan doesn't quite have a standard ground law, but it's something akin to one.
What does this have to do with justification?
I'm going to explain it to you. It's important.
Mm-hmm.
If I tell you that the threat level is red, right? These are subjective threat levels, by the way.
Sounds scary.
Or a subjective threat level is yellow. Do you think that the red one is worse than the yellow?
Yeah, it sounds scarier.
Yes, it sounds scarier, right? But it's
we all remember
but it's a subjective
millennials
metric.
Anyways remember
and when
the
used
terrorist
in court,
threat level.
Hang on. When used in court, though, what they'll do is they'll hold up a little picture and say, just like in a hospital, when they point to the little emojis and they say, which one of these little emojis best represents how you felt? Is it the one with the cry eyes? Is it the one with the sad face? Or is it the one with the laugh emoji, right? Point to the emoji that represents how you feel the best. It's the same fucking thing they do when it comes to you getting tied up in a self-defense shooting. They'll say, tell me the state that you feel like you were in, the closest state. And they're like, threat level fucking red. That's how I felt. Because they're using your subjective interpretation, because that's the only thing we can go off of for making a determination of how you felt threatened. Now, you have to give external justifications for that a reasonable person could adhere to. Like, he was coming at me with a knife, so I emptied my entire magazine. Okay. People seem to think across the board. Hang on, seemingly.
So you admit you admit that the entire subjectivity hinges upon the rationality of the person in self-defense, and that an outside observer can state that something is irrational, that a fear is irrational, or that it's not justified as an observer.
But they can state those things even if it is, and that's the problem. So this is the problem. Is like, you say, well, an outside observer could say that it's unjustified. True. But they could also say it's unjustified and be wrong. They can also say it's justified and be wrong, which is why we have this huge gray area when it comes to defense of one's person.
So does it matter?
I think it does matter. Yeah. I think it matters. And that's why it hinges on the person's subjectivity more than anything, which is why we're having this entire argument. It's based on
So
your subjectivity that the threat was actually over, even though you can't really demonstrate it other than this is how I feel. This is why I think the threat was over because I feel like it was over. But you can't really demonstrate that it was, which is why this guy, by the way, is going to walk. And he had there's no reason for him to even stay there. He didn't even have to
I
stay
don't.
there.
I
He
mean,
hadn't,
I
you
don't know
know,
enough about like
well, he's
Texas
gonna
law
walk. I guarantee you
to
he's gonna
determine.
fucking walk, right? Somebody might make a little bit of a stink about the last shot because the media is, but no
Yeah, I
jury
don't
under the
care.
sun's
I
ever gonna convict him when they have an expert come up and say, "Yeah, he was panic firing. He went over to get the gun. He didn't know what else to do. He's not trained for this." Okay. And then the guy moved and his muscle memory took over. He fired the last shot. If he was
okay.
justified in the first, he's justified
Okay.
in the last.
So your argument is that what is and isn't justified is purely subjective. There is no objectivity to killing and
No,
murder
there's gonna
once
be there is
self-defense is in
no,
there.
of course,
So where's the
there are
objectivity?
objective standards as well, and those are actually written out via codes so that we know different objective standards. But the reason you have things like I think it's 91.4 in Texas, where it's literally gives you this example. Here's the example it says, if you're an electrician and you're working at somebody's house and their son comes up and punches you in the elbow, it would be unreasonable force to pull out a gun and shoot him,
Mhm.
right? They're giving you the objective standard of saying there needs to be some type, the force has to at least be justified to an extent, like your life is being threatened. And then it goes on to spell that out as
Mhm.
well. So it's important to note and understand here that when you're talking about the use of force being justified or unjustified, that there's both objective standards to start, but you're always going to end in a gray area of intent and a gray area of subjective feeling, which is how do you know you're being threatened to begin with? It's a feeling more than it is anything, more
So
than it is even an objective standard.
subjectivity does not apply in any way to whether or not a crime was committed, whether or not
That's
a
not true.
victim occurs. Yes, it does.
That's
Hear
the
me out.
difference between what's the
Let
difference between first,
shh,
second,
shh,
third degree
shh, shh.
murder?
Dude, I let you go. I let you. Right.
All right, fair
Hear me out.
enough. Go ahead.
The difference is in how we choose to punish them, right? Because we don't have a justice system that's based upon restitution, right? We have a justice system that's based upon restitution in part, right? Presumably people want us to have more of a rehabilitative justice system, right? Some people do on the left, right? But we also have a justice system that's based upon crime deterrence and punishment, right? As a means of saying, well, we believe that you're guilty and so you're deserving of this punishment. It's not necessarily restitution, right? It's not about paying the victim back so much as it is about deterring future. Are you there? Oh, sorry, you lagged out, but you can hear me. Right? So the difference that you're talking
you're
about in
fine. Go ahead,
intent,
man.
yeah, the difference that you're talking about in intent is not about whether or not it was justified. It plays, and the intent does not play a part in the justification. The intent plays a part in the punishment, whether or not we say it's manslaughter, right? Or whether or not we say it's murder 3, it's a crime of passion, right? Or it's murder 2, it's a murder that like they didn't necessarily plan, but occurred during a crime being committed, like robbing a liquor store or something, right? Or murder 1, I was watching crime documentaries for months planning it out, right? Like the intent changes the way that we punish the crime, but we don't, but we're not talking about whether or not the killing was justified. You're talking about things about whether or not we feel like we should punish this person. And that's different to saying whether or not the killing should have happened.
First of all, you're wrong. You're wrong across the board. Look, Fabian, you're wrong across the board on all of this. Intent does matter even when it comes to justifications at times. Intent does matter. An example of this might be a difference between rape and rough sex would be just intent. Okay. Intent does matter when it comes to criminality. The second thing that you need to
No,
understand
can you give me an
is
example
that
where it
when
actually
you're
matters?
talking about,
Because the example you gave me doesn't matter.
I just gave one. How does the
It
intent not matter?
it doesn't matter whether or not the rapist intends to rape or whether or not the rapist thinks they have consent. The rape is determined by whether or not
It
there's a
does.
victim.
Well, no, it does. Wait, no, it does matter. It does matter because
No,
the
it
whole
doesn't.
thing hinges on whether or not the person has the perception they've been given consent or not. The objective standard goes away.
But the victim is still a rape victim.
Right.
In either situation.
The victim. They're subjective. The victim standard is what makes the nation, you dumb fuck.
It's not.
That's what I just got done
saying.
Can you give 20 times?
Can you give an example that actually works?
What are you talking about?
There's a difference between consent in sex and intent from the abuser, right? So can you give me an example where whether or not a crime occurs is based upon the intent of the aggressor? You haven't given me one yet.
I just gave you one.
You literally haven't.
Yes, that's a crime. How is that a crime not based on intent?
Okay.
What's the
if I intend to rape you, right? And you say no, don't rape me, right? That's rape. Yeah. If I don't intend to rape you and I think that I have consent, despite the fact that the person is saying don't touch me and I force myself on them, that's still rape. My intent does not matter there. So give me an example where intent changes whether or not the crime occurs.
Well, even though you just actually said it yourself, because I can dive into your second example and we can pin it down real quick. I'll just make it easy.
Pin it down like the rape victim?
Yeah, you can. Hang on. You can fuck me when I'm passed out. That's fine. And then she passes out and you fuck her. And she wakes up and she doesn't remember giving you consent. Right? Now, from her subjective perspective, you raped her. And from your subjective perspective, you didn't.
You're adding subjectivity into it. You're adding subjectivity into it. She gave prior consent.
Because the whole crime at that point, and the point of consent, is generally an issuance of perspective.
No, you did not rape. You did not.
You think you gave it.
No, you're adding subjectivity to it where it need not exist because you're hoping to add this into your argument.
It is.
If she gave you prior consent. No, it's not. It's subjective. She gave you prior consent for free use, and she did not actively withdraw consent during the process. Therefore, it's not rape. Just because she forgot that gave you.
Wait.
No, you're just adding subjectivity to it. There's nothing subjective there.
Yes, it is. It is subjective. It's a subjective standard.
Can you give me an example? Can you give me an example?
I just did.
Right?
I just did.
You literally can.
I just did. By the way, self-defense is a subjective standard. It's a subjective standard. It's not
What
objective.
is subjective standard about self-defense?
Because the way that you perceive the situation and how you react to it is a way that you're going to get judged for it.
Mm-hmm.
What
you're being judged on
around your subjective standard is going to be taken into account how you felt, what you thought, how you thought those things, why you thought those things. Even if you didn't know the person was armed, but maybe you just said something like, it was dark and I didn't know for sure. That's a subjective standard that's going to be taken into account for whether or not you committed a crime. Yes, these are all subjective standards. Criminality revolves often around subjective standards. I don't know where you got the idea. It doesn't. That's why we have these gray areas, like reasonable use of force. You tell me what that means. What does reasonable use of force mean? You don't know. It's a subjective standard.
So the reason we have subjectivity in our judgment of these actions post hoc, right, is because we don't have a perfect capture of the of the intent, motivations, or anything of the people involved, right? We don't know. All we have is the evidence, right? We have the evidence of what that person claims, right? We might look at toxicology, we might look at physical evidence, we might look at camera footage, right? So we can measure certain things, but the thing that we don't know, right, is the thought process of both of the individuals, right? Now, whether or not
those things going to be taken into account,
whether or not the crime is committed, right, is kind of an unknowable situation as the observer. We do our best guess to attempt to understand whether or not that occurred, right?
Thank you. So it's subjective. It's subjective.
No, that's not what's subjective. What's subjective is our analysis and attempting to ascertain the truth, right? What we're talking about is after the fact, us attempting to find the truth based off of the evidence that we have, right? That's
Yes, but
different than whether or not the thing occurred. The thing occurred, right? And
but
so
we're talking about
there's
justification. We're talking about justification, and that's what's subjective, not whether or not an event occurred. The
no,
event occurring may not be in dispute, but whether or not it's
no,
justified may literally depend on, well, it was dark or and I couldn't see very well, or hey, the sun was shining and I could totally see. And that could be the difference between a murder charge and you walking. This one subjective standard, which gives justification to the entirety of the event. Even though the event occurred, it's still a subjective standard, even to
he made
ascertain the justification.
even if he was panic firing, right? He made the choice, right? And you may say, well, the choice was kind of removed from him because of the state of fear and anxiety, adrenaline, massive amounts of adrenaline, right? Fight or flight, etc. Regardless, he engaged in an act, right, where he was no longer using minimal necessary force. Now you say,
Okay.
right, you say that he's not because of the Voorhees effect, because it is a possibility
Yeah.
that an individual could have
I think
another
maybe I have a
gun.
way that we can both win, that I can turn you to my side very quickly. Let me try
Go
it
ahead.
this way. Let me try it this way.
Okay.
Do you consider me, generally speaking, to be a person of sound mind? Generally. And I consider you to be the same. Yet these two people of sound mind, have a disagreement on the circumstances of this particular event for justification. But both of us have a sound mind. So I need to ask you, how is it that I could look at this with a sound mind and say that he was justified? You look at it with a sound mind and say he was not, even though we're essentially operating off of the exact same principles for the justification. We both believe it was justified. We're hung up only on this one particular circumstance. Now we both agree the circumstance happened. We both understand the events around this thing happening, right? You understand my
What?
thought process, even of why I think the last shot was fine. And I even understand why you think it's not.
Okay.
What makes you right and what makes me wrong at this point?
So you're saying that I don't understand where you're going with this. We have a difference of opinion. So what?
Yeah, but how could two people of sound mind who agree on all of the facts and have the same moral justification still walk away from this thing having a difference in opinion?
When you say that you're of sound mind, right? That you're
Mhm.
like, right, that means that you have a capacity for reason. It doesn't mean
Yeah.
you're using your reason correctly. That doesn't mean you're right. If that was the
Well, I
case,
didn't
then like
say
people would be
I'm
right about all kinds of things.
I'm asking why it would be that you think this and I think that, other than our subjective perspective.
What do you mean other than our subjective perspective? We could do the same
Yeah.
thing about like the communist, right? There are plenty of communists that have sound mind, right? They're capable
Yeah,
of
but we're not
rationality.
agreeing to all of the facts of communism with the communist. You're agreeing
We might
with
agree
me on
with
all the
some
facts.
You might
Yeah,
agree,
but
like
we're
we could
saying in
a
this,
communist might look at
we're
the facts
agreeing.
differently.
Yeah, but
This
in
is
this,
silly.
we're agreeing with all of the facts, and we agree even on the justification. Yet somehow we still walk away with a difference of opinion. What could that be other than subjective perspective? What could it possibly be if we agree on all of it in totality? What could possibly be the differential besides our subjective interpretation?
So everything. So you're saying that I'm lacking any that. I'm trying to figure out where you're going with this because I don't understand what you're saying. We have a different opinion.
I'm asking
Therefore,
you
the
a
opinion
direct
is subjective.
question. I just want an answer to the question. Don't try to think two steps ahead. Don't try to figure out where I'm going
No,
with
no, no.
it.
I'm
Just
trying to figure out
answer
what
the
it is that
fucking
you're asking.
question. Just answer the
Right.
question.
Right. He didn't
Why?
use minimal necessary
How
force.
is it that we could agree on everything, including the justification, and still not agree on this? How
Because
could that be other than our own subjective analysis? How?
right. Yes, we have different opinions. Yes.
Subjective analysis. And this is
Why?
exactly what happens to the
No, I'm
person who's being attacked. He has a subjective analysis, and we would take that into account because I guarantee you, if this guy gave his justification right now on your show, he came on your show tomorrow and said,
Mhm.
here's why I did what I did. I was panicked. I didn't know for sure. Okay, I thought maybe he was reaching for it. I fired that last shot. You'd say it was totally justified, and I know you would.
I would say is unjustified.
Even though it was from his subjective analysis, I still think you would say it was justified if that's what he said.
It's not justified because he had neutralized the target, right? He had someone that was face down, unarmed, wounded. He could have made the choice. You might argue that he couldn't have, but he could have made the choice, presumably, to back up and wait for police to arrive. Instead, he chose to execute the person. Right?
That's some
it was
fucking
no longer a threat.
That's some progressive speak where you're throwing in a whole set of your subject. So what you're doing is you're trying to map yourself onto this guy's mind. Hang on, you're trying to map yourself onto his mind.
No, I'm not.
And say, if I'm in his situation, what would I do? I wouldn't have taken that last shot.
No.
So you would have unjustifiably executed him? Like what?
I understand logic has been really difficult for you this entire time, but hear me out.
Oh, yeah. Right? I'm the one hurting for the logic tonight.
Just because something is unjustified doesn't mean that I don't necessarily understand. Doesn't mean that I don't have empathy for the individual. But also doesn't mean you yourself, right? You kind of highlighted this with the rape analogy, right? Where you're saying the person didn't know that they were a rapist, therefore no rape occurred, right?
No.
The problem is that the rape did occur. No,
yeah,
the rape.
No, that's
rape
not what I'm saying.
did.
I said that there's.
It is what you're saying. No. You're gonna let me finish. Let me finish this.
That's because you're misrepresenting what was stated.
I'm not misrepresenting what was stated.
Yeah,
right.
You are.
I asked you to give me an example, which you were unable to produce.
No, I did give you an example of subjective.
No, you were unable to produce.
Another one just now. Not only that, I gave you another one pertaining specifically to this case, where I said the only delineation point you and I have is a subjective analysis. Now, you, on the other hand, Fabian, have absolutely failed to explain why, if the first shot was justified, the last shot was not. Okay. All those shots were intended to kill him. Okay. All of them were intended to kill him. Why
I don't
was
know.
The last shot not justified. Why?
This is a really bad bet. This is really bad faith, man. Like you know what I mean? Like you're pretending to not understand what I say, and then keep circle back to your talking points and acting like you don't understand what I'm saying. You do understand what I'm saying.
It's
you
irrational.
Just disagree. It's not irrational.
It is irrational.
Otherwise,
you would be able to answer that question.
What question am I unable to answer?
Why was the first shot justified, but the last shot was not justified? Why can you take the head off with the sword, but the stab is not justified? Not with the justification.
We've already
circumstances.
We've already thrown away the samurai situation because we're talking about specific training and muscle memory versus panic fire. They're different situations.
Irrelevant. Let's say he did it with no training. He had no training whatsoever. That's just what his muscles did. What did he do wrong?
Again,
like what? Why was
it's unjustified to mutilate the corpse? It doesn't matter. Now, again, he did not use minimal necessary force. He had the capacity. To once the target was neutralized, right, to wait until authorities arrived. He chose to execute.
Why is it unjustified under your worldview to mutilate the corpse?
Because it's property of the family at that point.
It's property of the family. So you're saying he's unjustified from doing the stab when he just goes like this and then he does this before he even realizes the guy is dead and his head is gone, right? And the knife is in the guy. Your justification for why he did what he's wrong is because he was damaging that guy's family's property of his dead body.
You've already
that's your justification.
Listen,
honestly,
listen, relax. You've already admitted defeat on this argument because of the rape analogy that you wanted to use, right? You recognize that someone can be an accidental aggressor. You've already admitted this, that someone could not have the intent to be. Right. You've already stated that someone can do an unjustified act that is unethical, right? But not have malicious intent, that the person could accidentally do something that is against someone else. I've never argued
the point.
Right. This is what we're talking about, right? Just like someone could believe, right, that they are not raping someone when they are in fact raping someone, someone could execute someone that is lying on the ground despite having the capacity to hold them until police are available,
Yeah,
right?
but
But
just saying that
choose not to do so and not have malicious intent
but
or be in
Fabian,
legitimate fear of their life.
just saying that this could happen, these things could be true. These coulds. I can agree to almost all coulds. That doesn't mean
Well, no,
that's
it did
what
happen.
is. That
It did
no, it
happen. It
didn't
was an
happen. That's
unjustified
not what
execution.
happened. Hang on.
It
Not only was
is.
that not what
Fact.
happened, but I want to go back to this real quick because it's not a fact. I want to go back real quick to this idea that the reason the second stab of the katana is unethical in your worldview and it's unjustified because at that point, even the person who just lopped the head off 1 second ago hasn't even registered the head is gone, who then inserts the sword into the body. In your worldview, the reason that's unjustified is because he's damaging the body, the corpse of
Mhm.
that person's family. I just want to make sure
Yes.
that's your justification. Why
Yes.
is that a justification we should adhere to as reasonable people?
Well, you believe in private property rights, presumably. You
No.
believe in
I believe
non-aggression.
in some property rights, and I don't believe in the non-aggression principle. I reject both of these things out of hand. So why is it that
That's a
I should
debate. That's a
adhere?
that's a
Well,
that's a
no,
debate for another
that is
time.
the debate.
You're
Why
trying to
is it
pivot
that
away from your defeat.
no, I'm directly on this point. Why should I adhere to this justification? Because you consider this justification to be valid. I don't think any reasonable person,
You're running.
including
You're running.
libertarians, would
You're
consider this
running.
justification to be valid, Fabian. Not
You're
one.
running. You are
From
running
what?
so
From
scared.
directly answering the
You're
question?
attempting to force the conversation into a
Into
you're
the
attempting to
conversation itself?
shh,
I'm trying to
you're
actually
attempting
force it
shh, relax.
into the
You're attempting to
conversation.
shh. You're trying to force this back into your bad samurai analogy, right? And you're trying to force a conversation into the justification for private property rights, right? And we've had this discussion before. It's an entirely different debate about argumentation ethics and the basis for private property rights because you already know that you've lost the debate with your own analogies on
see if I can,
the case that we're talking about self-defense.
Let's see which of us is correct then. If what you're saying is true or if what I'm saying is true. I'm asking you, right?
Mhm.
What you're claiming that he's unjustified in the final shot, yes?
Yes.
So then would it be appropriate for me to question your means for why that's unjustified or no?
It's perfectly appropriate.
Okay, great.
That's
So
what this entire debate has
would
been until you tried to pivot.
consider the samurai analogy to be questioning your justification on why you consider this to be an execution and unjustified?
I would consider
Even
it
though
to
it has
be.
the same sequence of circumstances, Fabian?
It doesn't
How
have
is
the
that
same
me
sequence.
running?
They're multiple principal differences, and now you're trying to get
Name
into a
one.
situation.
Name one principal difference.
Well, one person's trained and the other person's not trained.
I just said,
That's
let's
one.
say there's no training. No training
Okay.
involved whatsoever.
Second one, we're talking about
No,
mutilating.
just the first one.
Second one, we're talking about. Well, okay, but you've changed the analogy, so now there isn't that principal difference. Fair enough. So the first one, right? You're talking about sword versus gun.
That's not a principal
May or may not.
difference.
Right. There may or may not, but that really only matters if you're taking the subjectivity route that you're taking.
None of
right?
these
So
are principal
it's a
differences.
principal difference for you, but not necessarily for me. The third one would be that you're talking about what you do to a corpse after you've already beheaded the person and killed them versus what you do to someone that you've already neutralized and you do a further act of killing the person.
Okay.
Which is a huge difference.
So your actual principal argument is in the samurai analogy. You're saying that he mutilated a corpse. And in this analogy for the headshot, what is the delineation point and justification then?
Well, the headshot is killing someone that is alive.
But what's your justification that it's not justified? What is that justification?
Minimal necessary force. Right?
Yeah, but why
This person at every capacity.
Yeah, why do you consider that minimal? Why should we adhere to a standard of minimal force instead of reasonable?
Okay, because if you don't adhere to minimal necessary force, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then what you're saying is that it is justified to use any force, use maximum force.
No, I'm not
right,
saying
for
that.
Any
I'm saying it's justified
threat.
to use reasonable force.
Okay, well then, what is reasonable?
What is minimal?
Okay, minimal is the absolute lowest amount of force that you believe that you can do in the situation, and that the
That who
observer
believes?
recognizes.
That
That
who believes?
the individual believes, as
Hmm.
well as the outside observer believes.
So then, what would reasonable force be if not the same exact thing, just inserting the word reasonable over minimal? Now, you tell me why the standard of minimal is better than the standard of reasonable. I can't wait.
Okay, there is no principal difference really between minimal and reasonable if the standard of reasonable is minimal, right? So
That's
the
well, no,
problem is,
that's not what I said. That's not what I said.
well,
I just said you could take the
can
word
reasonable
reasonable
be
and
different
insert it
than
over
minimal?
minimal, and you
Can
would end up
reasonable be different? Can reasonable and minimal
well,
be different?
yes. Reasonable is
What's the
different than
difference?
minimal.
Right.
The
What's the
difference bet
difference?
well, what so your adherence to minimal doesn't mean
Hmm.
anything. It's a
Okay.
subjective perspective, just like reasonable is a subjective perspective. I don't know what you mean when you say minimal because it's a
Minimal.
subjective
It's
perspective.
not. No. 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 Maybe. All right. Let me explain the difference. Right. So minimal necessary force is objective. Right. It is the absolute minimal. The problem accounts from can some. No. 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 Hear me out.
You're defining it
Can
with itself.
No. 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 Minimal is objective because it is the minimal. It is the least amount of force that would be required, right? Given
Yeah,
all
but
of
we
the
don't
facts in
know,
order to.
but that's going to be subjective.
Yes, the minimal is not subjective, right?
Yes, it is.
But no, 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 no,
Yes,
no,
it
no, no,
is.
no, no. Stop pretending to be stupid and interrupting so that you can
Bro,
attempt to win an argument.
you're
Stop.
wrong. You're
Listen,
wrong.
Jesus Christ. We actually did need a moderator today. I thought you would be good faith, but you've
No,
been
you're
nothing but
just
bad faith
wrong.
this
But
entire conversation.
dude, you're
You've been
fucking
you've been
wrong.
you've been routed so many times, and yet you just pretend to not understand what I'm saying as a means of winning. It's really bad. It's not
I
cool.
can literally
But
reiterate what you just said back to you and tell you why it's wrong. You just said,
right, you won't
go
stop
ahead.
interrupting. Okay.
Go ahead, Fabian.
Listen. So minimal is objective, right? Is there, like, given, if we have perfect knowledge, if we assume that we have perfect knowledge after the fact, is there a point, right, where you would not stop the situation, and then there is a point where you would stop the situation, and then anything above that point, right, would be a situation that is using more force than is necessary?
That could be mapped on completely with maximum or moderate or reasonable with the exact same subjective result. It wouldn't matter a bit.
So you
You're
won't
saying
answer the
with
question.
perfect I'm answering it. You're saying because it's a non sequitur. You're asking me if we had perfect knowledge of what minimal was, which we don't, would we know what minimal was? Sure. But since
Okay,
we
so
don't, since we
shh,
don't, it's subjective.
stop. Minimal is not subjective. Our interpretation is like so a truth can exist, right? Irrespective of our opinion of the truth. That doesn't necessarily mean that we know the truth if we're searching for the truth, right? So there is a truth. There is a fact, and that is minimal necessary force. What we do after the fact is attempt to ascertain what is minimal necessary force. Now, you've already admitted that you can be an
Through a
accidental
subjective
criminal.
lens. Through a
You
subjective
right.
lens.
Yeah, we do the best
So
of our
it's
ability,
subjective.
and our bias and subjectivity plays in our
Yeah, so
ability
it's
to
objective.
ascertain the truth. No, Jesus Christ.
Yes. It's subjective. There's
You're
no way around it.
you're not good faith enough to have this conversation.
This is the most good faith I
Like, you
could ever
won't.
be in my life. There's
Well,
no
then you.
possible way any human being could be more good faith with you than I'm being right now. You're just wrong. You're not correct. You're incorrect. It's subjective. You say even with perfect knowledge, which we'll never have, you admit we'll never have the perfect knowledge. So therefore, any way for us to gauge what
This is a
minimal
joke.
even
This
means
is a
is through
meme
some
debate
type
at
of
this point.
subjective outlook.
You have no desire to argue in good faith.
I can't possibly think of how I could argue in better faith. What could I
Okay.
say that would be better faith? What am I not addressing?
Our interpretation of minimal necessary force, right, can be subjective. Our investigation can be subjective, right? But there is an objective metric out there, regardless of our ability to be able to perfectly ascertain it. There is an objective point where there is minimal necessary force, and then there is force above that minimal necessary force.
What's your point?
Correct.
Even if all of it's true, what's your point?
Right. When you go above minimal necessary force, you are engaged in a crime.
Okay, but
you can accidentally be engaged in a crime.
Okay, so let me ask you, can we know what that minimal is? Can we know? Even if the truth is out there, can we know it? Can we know what that minimal force is?
It depends upon the situation, right? Like, we don't always have perfect knowledge
where we would know what the minimal force would be.
So you even talked about the subjectivity, right? Like that, but it's not really subjectivity so much as like our ability to ascertain. You talked about the Voorhees effect, right? Right? We don't know, right? We cannot know without the execution shot, right? Whether or not that person could have, let's say, sprouted wings, turned into a demon, and ripped the heads off of everyone in the room, right?
No, I think you can reasonably ascertain that that's not possible.
Why? So is it a probability game?
Well, yeah, of course. It's completely unreasonable.
Right. So we attempt to adhere.
Unreasonable assertion. It makes no sense. When you're talking about minimal, when you say minimal force, you're talking about your own personal subject opinion of what minimal means. You can't be talking about anything else. You don't know what that would be. You can't know it. There's no measurement for it. You just like say it like it means something more than that's why they use the word reasonable. Because we can't even use maximum force. We don't know what the fuck it would be. What would maximum force be? Me going and getting a tank and blowing you up with it? Or would it be a nuclear bomb? I mean, I don't know what the fuck you would even mean by maximum.
Maximum is not, it's irrelevant to the discussion of justification because everything above minimal necessary force is unjustified.
Oh, yeah, but you haven't told me what minimum force would constitute, except that minimum would exist if we knew all things. But it's going to be based on your subjective analysis still.
Hold on, real quick. Always going to be based on 1 second. Do not link this fucking video in chat. All right? If you want to DM it to people via Discord or some shit, I can't control that. It's gore and I'm live on Twitch. I can't just don't I will delete the link. Sorry, could you repeat what you were saying?
Yeah, I was just saying this is very simple, right? You can't really give me a metric other than a subjective one for what minimal force would be. It's going to be based on whatever your subjective outlook is. It's actually better to use the word reasonable because reasonable doesn't put in minimum, maximum, intermediate force. It's just looking at the facts of the situation and saying, what do you think a reasonable person under these circumstances would likely do? And then adhering to that, which, by the way, falls in line perfectly with your argumentation ethics.
No. So what you were talking about is how we as a society choose to judge people because we want to deter people from just killing, right? And we also recognize that people have a right of self-defense, right? Now, the gray area of subjectivity that you're discussing, right, is our lack of perfect knowledge, right? And so we recognize that there's a gray area of a lack of perfect knowledge. And so we choose to allow people to do certain things that may be justified or may be unjustified, right? That is what we are talking about. What I am arguing is that given the facts of the case, we recognize that this person's last shot with having everything available, having the knowledge that we have available after to us, it seems fairly clear, given the evidence, right, that they didn't need to do that last shot. That they could have kicked the gun away and stayed there. They could have stayed back. They could have waited for authorities. That the target was neutralized by all available information that we have. Your argument is that there's a gap of perfect knowledge, and therefore it's justified.
Don't tell me what my argument is. I'm going to make my argument once again to this one more time. Mm-hmm. Okay. Everything you just said is within the purview of your own subjective analysis based on some minimalistic principle that you haven't even justified as being something I should even follow to begin with. You just continuously assert it's justified because it's justified because I say it's justified. We should do this because we should do this because we should do this. You haven't actually told me one time why that justification is something I should adhere to. And when I brought it up, you said we're not going to go down in the realm of justification, even though what
That's
we're
not what I
talking
said.
about is
That's not
something
what I
that's
said.
justified.
No,
Yes,
we
it
were
is
talking
what
about
you
a
said.
we were talking about a different situation with a
No,
samurai.
we're talking about the
this
same
is getting into it.
situation, but
No, we're
we'll
not.
map it right
Stop,
onto this
stop, stop.
situation.
Don't
Why
lie,
should I
please.
adhere even in this situation then? When you say that that's justified, why should I adhere to your moral framework that it's not
Okay, so
justified that he fired the last shot? Tell me why.
okay,
What's wrong in my ethical system? Yeah.
okay, so what you're saying is why should we try and use objectivity, deontology, if you will, to determine whether or not something is or isn't justified? And instead, why shouldn't we just use a subjective opinion of people and what they feel is right or wrong, right?
No,
so what you're saying
what
is
I'm saying,
why shouldn't we be consequentialists, right? And we should just have
no,
a subjective opinion of what is right or wrong.
like you're just
Right?
making it up as you go. Listen, I'm going to say it one more time. I want to be as specific as possible. You say it's unjustified, that last shot. I ask you why
Yes.
it's unjustified. You say because we should be using minimal force. Is that correct?
Yes.
Why should I be using minimal force? That's what I want justified.
Because minimal force is the only objective measurement that we can do to determine whether or not someone becomes the aggressor in the situation.
Why can't you use reasonable force?
Because reasonable force, you already stated, hinges upon the subjectivity of the intent. And I've already laid bare why there's so many problems with that.
Yeah, so does minimal force. So
no, it does not. It literally doesn't. I've explained this to you a bunch of times.
Yeah, but
you're
lying
lying
because
you're lying. You're just lying now.
You're just wrong. You're wrong. So reasonable force, I can give you a great definition for, which is that we're going to map on what we think most reasonable, sane people acting in a sane capacity would do in a given situation. That would be reasonable. What's minimal? What's minimal force? Give me the definition for minimal force in Fabian's worldview.
Do we need to define minimum?
Minimal force. Tell me what it is.
Do we need to define minimum?
I need you to tell me what minimal force is. Yeah.
Do we need to define minimum? You know what the word minimum means?
I need you to define minimal force. Yeah. I know
okay,
what
so
minimum.
Okay, so you know what minimum is?
Yeah, the least amount of.
Okay. Do we need to define force?
Yeah, I need to know what the least amount of force in a self-defense situation means if it's not subjective. If it's objective, like you're claiming.
So you're not confused by minimum force or the definition of minimum force. You're not confused with the definitions of minimum or force. So what are you not understanding?
I'm not understanding how it's not subjective.
So I don't understand how you couldn't understand that. You've actually stumped me. I can't figure out how to deal with that level of stupidity. I don't know. I don't know how to explain to you that that the smallest amount of something is something that can exist in the world. I don't know how to explain that to you. It's too blatantly obvious.
Okay, so again, we'll agree on what force is. We agree on what minimum is. I need you to explain how it's not subjective.
Okay, is 2 less than 3?
Yes.
Okay. So you recognize that numbers can be smaller than larger numbers, that quantities of things can be smaller than et cetera, right? The one quantity can be larger than another quantity. Yep. One measurement can be larger than a measurement, right?
Yep.
Okay.
I agree.
So now when we talk about minimal necessary force, we're talking about to stop an action from occurring, right? So what is the smallest amount of a thing, of force, right, that would stop another force, right?
I agree. How would you explain what that is unless it's subjective?
Okay, so you have at absolute velocity, right? You have a 10-pound object, and then another one moving at the exact same speed clashes. In order to stop it, it must be 10 pounds or more, correct?
I don't know. Yeah, sure.
Right. So if it's 11 pounds or 12 pounds, right, that's more than minimum, right?
Yeah, I
guess.
guess.
Same situation is applying here.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
There's a
But
minimum amount of force
okay.
that would
We're
stop
talking.
it.
So we're talking about inside of a mathematical equation.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell me something that deals in the realm of absolutes, what's absolutely so. Nobody's
Okay.
disputing that. Inside of a self-defense situation, which is in and of itself subjective based on the feelings of the person being attacked and the feelings of the attacker themselves, not to mention the feelings of the onlooker, how would you determine what's minimalist force inside of that situation unless it's you using your own subjective analysis of what you think they could have done that would have been minimal instead, like what you've done with this situation, mapping on different things that he could have done. That's
You're
all within your
finally here with me.
subjective purview.
You're finally here with me. Minimal necessary force is objective. Our ability to ascertain that, right, is like our ability to ascertain perfect knowledge has limitations. Right?
So
We don't have perfect
for
knowledge.
the 300th time, how would we ascertain what is minimal force outside of your subjective analysis? And the answer is you can't, right?
But the answer is that you do the best that you can to ascertain the truth.
It's because it's subjective, right?
No, minimal necessary force is not like you're. I'm trying not to get worked up because you're doing this on purpose. You're intentionally bad faith.
You deserve every bit of this because what you're saying is so insanely absurd on its face that you're
It's
just
not insanely
arguing for no
absurd.
particular reason at this point.
You're
Baby, just say it's
pretending to be
subjective.
exacerbated
Just
and
say it's
confused.
subjective. That's it. Just say
No,
it's subjective.
minimal necessary force is not subjective. Our ability, right, to determine minimal necessary force, right, uses metrics that have subjective bias baked into them, right? We're humans.
It's subjective.
Our ability to obtain, right?
Then it's subjective, bro. I don't know what to tell you. If you can't ascertain it outside of subjectiveness, then it's a subjective standard, just like reasonable force would be.
It's not. It's just not. I don't understand how you can't get this.
But reasonable force is the same. Exactly, it is. It's exactly the same. Reasonable force is a subjective standard. The difference is with reasonable
You've already proven
is within the purview of the definition.
Times.
I can say what we're trying to do is this: ascertain what we think a reasonable person would do under reasonable circumstances. This is the justification standard that we would go off of. I think it's a completely correct justification standard. Fabian says no, we should use a standard for minimal force. That's what my reasoning is for why he's not justified in shooting this guy. But when I ask him, isn't that a subjective standard? He says no, but it is. And all he has to do is say it is. We could move on to the next side of the topic.
It's not, no, I'm trying to think how I can dumb this down for you. I don't know that I can because I don't think no matter how much I dumb this down, you won't still pretend to not understand and just go, it's gobbledygook, right? Like what we're talking about is an objective standard. Our ability to measure it is imperfect. Our ability to measure it is imperfect because we don't have perfect knowledge, right? Can you grasp that?
I've conceded to it 300 times. That would make it a subjective standard.
That would not make it a subjective standard. That would make the product subjective. Wouldn't make the standard itself subjective.
If you're asking me this bizarre question, like if you have complete perfect knowledge of a thing, do you have perfect knowledge of it? The answer is yes, but we don't. So any standard that you apply to self-defense is going to be subjective, Fabian, whether it's max, minimum, in between, wherever, it's always going to be a subjective standard. So the thing is that when they say reasonable, the reason they state reasonable, the reason that standard is way better than minimal, whatever this bizarre standard is that you're coming up with, that is totally subjective, is because we're saying we can map on a reasonable person's behavior in that given circumstance. We're going to take everything into account.
I'm going to have to explain it for your audience because you're going to pretend to not understand it. Right.
Explain it.
Right. So what you're talking about is a criminal justice system, right, that is designed to punish bad people and deter crime, right? And designed to protect people via the punishment and deterring crime and locking up the bad people so that we're safe, and to hopefully reform some of those bad people if they can be reformed at all. What I am talking about is a thing justified, right? I've already explained that individuals with no ill will, no malicious intent, can do things that are aggressive that produce a victim, right? If a person believes that they have consent and they have sex with another person, and that person withdraws consent, right? But the other person is of the opinion that they believe that they have consent. In their mind, they're doing nothing malicious. They're engaged in a consensual, happy sexual relationship. But there is still a rape occurring, and there is still a rape victim, right? And so that is the issue, is that the sex was unjustified. We can recognize that the person believed that they were justified in their actions. We can recognize that the person may not be deserving of the same punishment if we're using a system that is designed to stop bad people and we care about intent. It's not necessarily the exact justice system that I advocate for, though I think plenty of covenant communities would perfectly be reasonable in doing so, right? And I may choose to live in one. That's beside the point. What we're talking about is, did a crime occur in an objective sense where there was a victim? And what I'm saying is that in this shooting, there were available options that were less force than was necessary to defend himself and to stop the crime from occurring. And you're saying,
why is that the standard I should adhere to instead of reasonable? For the 300th time, even if I grant all of this, why is that the standard I should adhere to?
Because if the reason you should adhere to it is because it is an objective metric of whether or not there is a victim that has been aggressed upon.
Reasonable is also an objective metric by the same standard, then.
No, it's not.
Why not?
Because it's focusing on intent and fifis and not focusing on whether or not someone was a victim of a crime. It's not focused on any objective metric.
And how would you ascertain it if something was minimal other than those qualities?
Reasonable force is based upon fifis. That's the metric that's being used. Minimal necessary force, right, is not based upon fifis. It's based upon an objective metric.
How would you ascertain it? How would you ascertain it without fifis?
We have imperfect knowledge. And so we're not always going to get the correct answer in this. That doesn't change whether or not in reality there was a person that was the victim of an aggression.
It's insane to me. What's it based on? Isn't it still based on subjective fifis? If you have imperfect knowledge, you know that you're not going to be able to actually ascertain what the truth of the situation is. You can't know what the objective.
I've already answered this question a bunch of times.
But if you can't know it, it's still subjective, bro. I don't know what to tell you.
You're lying.
You know what? Here's the thing, too. You can bring Kaz in here because he says the arguments are weak. I would love to know how the fucking arguments are weak, Kaz. You can come in here. You can 2v1 because I honestly don't fucking understand this. It's insanity from my perspective. Makes no sense from my perspective. Maybe I'm way the fuck out, but I'm happy to throw the lifeline out. If you want to come in, Kaz, and you want to explain to me how the fuck it is that I'm wrong and this was murder and why I should adhere to your standard, I'm all about it. During the call-in section, obviously, but you know, I'm just saying. I
mean, we're talking in circles. I feel like what I just said.
I'm ready. I'm ready for it to be. I'm ready for it to be done. Kaz says he doesn't want to come on because I'm weak, right? So okay, says Kaz, right? Okay, fair enough, Kaz. Anyway, I'm done too, man. I'm not getting anywhere with this. I appreciate kind of the butting of heads, though. If you guys want to bring in the callers while we're giving our closings, I think that'll be fine. You know, you did open first. I'll let you close first so I can close last. That's usually how we do it. Does that sound all right to you?
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, just
go ahead, man.
I'll keep it short and sweet, right?
You don't have to keep it that short. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, fair enough. The argument is pretty simple, right? There is an objective truth out there in natural law, right? You can say that this natural law is based upon God. You can say that it's based upon logic, right? But I am a subscriber that there is objective truth in reality, that A equals A. And so, because of this, there is an objective truth to natural law. There's an objective truth to certain things that cannot be argued against. I've if you've seen some of the other debates about argumentation ethics and things like that, you should watch them again on the Crucible. I'm not even telling you to go to mine, right? Go watch me talk about this in other debates here. And so, what I am stating is quite simple, that when an individual is robbing an establishment, the crime that they have committed is a threatening of your life. And the other crime that they've attempted to commit is the robbery, right? Now, logically, when you're in danger, you have the right to defend yourself, and thus it is justified to shoot at that person, even if that results in killing them, right? Until the threat is no longer there. In this case, the individual shot the person, they're wounded, they're on the ground. He then goes up, he kicks away their firearm, they're no longer armed, and then he shoots them in the back of their head. This is enacting justice upon this person. This is punishing them beyond the crime that they are stopped from being able to argue for themselves, which is to say they cannot argue against being robbed of equal and double force. They cannot argue with their life being threatened, but they can argue that they shouldn't be executed. And so this person went above and beyond what was necessary to detain them so that restitution could be paid, thus making this unjustified. If we say that subjectivity matters and the way that we feel in whether or not a crime occurred, whether or not a victim of aggression occurred, then what we do is we add in the subjectivity of the person's personal feelings into the way that they react and respond in situations as to whether or not it is moral, which can only be concerned after we determine whether or not it is justified, right? Morality comes after justification, right? In order for it to be a moral or immoral, in order for it to be a moral action, it must first be justifiable. And so what you're saying is that it is justifiable within the domains of things that we cannot prove are wrong to use any amount of force in response to any amount of aggression. So if you steal a candy bar, I'm allowed to beat you to death in my store because you've put me in a state of war and I can't trust that you're not a criminal. I can't trust that you might not pull out a gun at some point to stop me, etc. No. What the right answer is the one that I've laid out, a minimal necessary force. Again, we recognize, though, that like when we talk about reasonable, when we talk about punishing someone, we recognize that there are situations where a person didn't mean to do what they did, right? This is the flaw of our current criminal justice system, is that it's not based off of restitution. Instead, it's based off of deterrence, and it's based off of locking up the bad guys, and it's based off of our fifis of wanting justice. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth is fine, but what we're talking about is not an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. What we're talking about is punishing people based off of intent, and the intent doesn't actually change whether or not there's a victim and how much damage was done to the victim. Nevertheless, we recognize that we don't want to harm somebody to an extreme extent if we feel that what they did was something that a reasonable person could do. That is not an argument about whether or not an action is justified. That's an argument about how we as a society feel that we should punish a person, what we ought to do to them to make things right. And there are a lot of issues with that. And I wish we would have gotten more into kind of that situation, but we couldn't agree on just like understanding that objective reality exists. So there you go.
All right. So I'll give my close here. So try to understand, this was supposed to be based around whether or not this guy was justified, mostly in firing this last shot. Fabian never actually gave me a justification for it. He just asserted that we ought to use minimal force. We couldn't really tell me why we ought to use minimal force, just asserted that we should over and over and over again. And he said the reason for that is because minimum force exists in an objective reality that we could never actually know. So therefore, the end point of it was that it would always be a subjective standard as much as reasonable force is going to be a subjective standard. And how could it not be, right? It's going to be subjective. There is no actual justification. And I wanted to get in on it, and I tried to, but he said I was diverting the conversation and being bad faith when I attempted to say, why should we adhere to these standards and your justifications just based on that, rather than my standards of justification using Christian ethics? He says, no, that's a different debate entirely, but I think not. I think it comes down to justification and why we should adhere to his standard. This guy was in a position where he was threatened and a gun was pulled and it was in his face, and he had every conceivable reason to believe that his life was in danger, and there was danger to the lives of everybody in the establishment that he was in. Did he use a reasonable amount of force? Yeah, I think he did. I think from everybody's subjective standard who's reasonable and of sound mind, they can understand the multitudes of reasons why he would fire the final shot, even having the gun in his hand, understanding the types of pressures that he would be under, understanding the type of sensory deprivation he was going through, the fact that he did not put himself in the situation, but the situation was put on him. All of these things are reasonable things, and reasonable reasons a person would respond the way that he did. Fabian doesn't even really disagree with me, just says instead that while I agree with all those points, I disagree with the end point of the justification for the final shot, but can't really give me the merits of why he disagrees with that justification, even though he agrees with me on everything else, or why my justification is bad of ending the threat, or how it somehow ethically doesn't add up. None of those arguments came into play. So I think it was fruitful in a way. I just think that Fabian had pretty weak arguments in that they were based around subjectivity. So just me. But I appreciate him coming out to debate, and I appreciate everybody showing up to chat. So you mind if I hop into the callers here, Fabian?
No, go ahead. You just watched a clip from our Twitch channel, Fabian Liberty. If you like content like this, please like and subscribe here on YouTube, or go ahead and give us a follow on twitch.tv/Fabian Liberty.